Hello, Eric Buck, Associate Broker with RE/MAX Properties of the Summit in Breckenridge, Colorado, and RE/MAX Excalibur in Tucson, Arizona. A while back, I did a Facebook Live on how to do debits and credits on a closing settlement statement. That live video follows, and I hope it helps you in understanding how to do debits and credits. Enjoy.
First thing I want to do is go through my rules for settlement statement. Really kind of 6 simple rules to keep in mind. First one is that the debits and credits on a closing statement have nothing to do with your normal accounting debits and credits. You're not going to see the 2 numbers on both sides of the ledger match up with one another. And if you think about debits in the way like a loan would be something you owe and therefore a debit, and that's true in regular financial accounting, but that's not true with our settlement sheets. And I'll get to why that is in just a moment. So forget anything about accounting when you're looking at the debits and credits here. The second is only things that happen at the closing table show up on the settlement statement. If you pay a vendor ahead of time, that's not going to be on the settlement statement. It's only the events that occur at the table that are going to show on this settlement statement. Third, there are only 2 parties to the settlement statement, the buyer and the seller. Any third party, even if there's a transaction with them, their side of that transaction is not going to show on the settlement statement, and we'll see some examples of that as we move along. So when we look at a settlement statement, the buyer wants to bring as little money to the table as possible. That's going to make him happy. And the seller wants to take home as much money as he can, and that's going to make him happy. So for the buyer, anything that makes him happy is a credit, and the same for the seller. Anything that makes them unhappy is going to be a debit. If it makes the buyer unhappy, and when we're talking about happy, it's just talking about how much money they have to bring to the closing table. If it makes the buyer unhappy, it's a debit. If it makes the seller unhappy, it's a debit as well. So let's move on to the actual settlement sheet. And we see here, we're going to assume a June 30 settlement. That'll just make some of the prorations easier to do. And I put the dollar amounts of each of the items down the left-hand column. And then we have our settlement statement right here. So we start out with the purchase price. And the purchase price is going to be a debit to the buyer and a credit to the seller. If this were the only transaction, then we'd see the buyer having to bring $500,000 of cash to the table and the seller taking home $500,000 in cash. Because we're going to, at the end of the day, add up all these columns, net them out at the bottom, and that's going to tell us how much the buyer has to bring, and how much the seller gets to take home. So let me look here and see if we've got any questions up yet. I don't see anything, so I'm going to move on. So now we got earnest money. The buyer has brought $20,000 of earnest money, or paid $20,000 of earnest money earlier, and it's being held by the escrow agent. So this is $20,000 that is going to go towards his purchase. He doesn't need to bring it to the settlement table again. So he gets a $20,000 credit for that. Now the seller isn't bringing that money, so we don't put any entry over on the seller. It's the escrow agent that's going to be bringing that money to closing, and the escrow agent doesn't show up on the settlement statement. So $20,000 credit to the buyer there, no entry to the seller. Now, our buyer's going out and got a new $300,000 loan. In this case, that's another $300,000 he doesn't have to bring to the closing table. The bank's going to bring that to the closing table. So that's a credit to our buyer. Now, again, it was the bank bringing the money, not the seller. So there's no entry on the seller side of the equation. Again, this is where we're different than normal accounting, where normal accounting, you got to give X dollars on one side and Y dollars on the other. And as part of this loan, we had a loan origination fee. Again, this is something that buyer has to pay, but it's going to go to the bank. So it's a it's a debit to the buyer. It's going to the bank, not to the seller, so no entry on the seller. Similar for points. You're paying the money for the points. Sometimes they get financed in, but you may have to bring them to the closing table instead. And in this case, the buyer has to bring this debit of $9,000, nothing on the seller side, because again, that money is not going to the seller. It's already included in the $500,000, well, the 9,000 of points is going to the bank, not to the seller. Now we have an assumed loan. These get a little tricky, but think of an assumption as the seller paying off what he owes and the bank just re-lending that money immediately to the buyer. So again, this is $50,000 that the buyer doesn't have to bring to the closing, so that's a credit to the buyer. And because the seller is in essence paying off this loan by transferring it over to the buyer, it's $50,000 debit to the seller. Now, the loan payoff, here we're referencing the seller paying off another loan. He may have had a $250,000 first loan and a $50,000 second mortgage, and that's the second is what he was assumed by the buyer, but the seller is going to pay off his $250,000 mortgage. Well, again, he's got to pay money to the bank, pay off that mortgage, so $250,000. That money is going to the bank, not to the buyer, so there's no entry on the buyer side. Now we get to unpaid taxes this year. So these are taxes for, say, 2020. We have a June 30th settlement, and no taxes have been paid as of yet. Well, obviously, the seller really owes half a year's worth of taxes, and the buyer is going to get billed for a full year of taxes early next year, probably. So we do an allocation of these taxes. Again, I made it easy doing a June 30th date, so it's 50-50. So the seller is going to pay $1,000 to the buyer to cover those 6 months that he was in the property. So it's $1,000 debit to the seller and $1,000 credit to the buyer. Now we have a survey, and this is being paid by the seller, which is typically the case. He's paying it to the survey company, so it's $500 out of his pocket, and the escrow agent's going to write that check to the survey company, not to the buyer, so there's no entry on the buyer's line in this case. Now, prepaid HOA, this is going to be the opposite of what we did for the taxes. In this case, the seller paid for a full year's HOA fees, but the seller's only going to live there for half a year, and the buyer is going to live there for half a year and wouldn't have paid anything. So in this case, we need the buyer to pay half a year's HOA fee, and that money is going to go to the seller because he already paid the full fee. He's going to get compensated there. So debit to the buyer, credit to the seller. Title insurance policy, in this case, the seller is going to pay for the owner's title insurance policy. So we put that $900,000 debit to the seller. Who's he paying it to? He's paying it to the title insurance company, not to the buyer, so there's no entry on the buyer. The buyer, on the other hand, is paying the lender's policy. You typically have the policy that covers the owner in terms of title insurance, and then there'll be a second policy that covers the lender. As I said, typically the seller pays the title for the owner's policy, but since it's really the buyer's fault that he has to buy a policy for the mortgage company, then more typically we see the buyer pay this. Now, everything is negotiable in real estate, but that's the more typical pattern. So we'll put $450 in there. Now, this is a little tricky. Unpaid taxes from prior year. So let's say the seller hadn't paid his taxes that were due in 2019. Well, those taxes have to get paid off for this transaction to go through. So what will happen is that the escrow agent will collect a year's worth of taxes for 2019 and immediately write a check to the county. So in that case, since it's taxes that the seller should have paid and didn't, we're going to take that money out of the seller's pocket. And it's being paid directly to the county in this case because it's due now, unlike the previous taxes we had that weren't going to be due for 6 or 8 months. This is past due and therefore will be paid immediately to the county. Buyer doesn't touch this money, doesn't show up on his side of the sheet. The broker commission is here we've got it at $30,000. So who pays the broker's commission? The seller does. So $30,000 as the broker commission. Appraisal fee, that's typically paid by the buyer, and again that money goes to the appraisal company, not to the seller. So will be a debit of $1,000 for the appraisal, but no entry on the seller side of the equation. And we have taxes and insurance reserves. Typically the lenders will want anywhere from 6 to 12 months worth of reserves. They have to be paid up front. And in this case we put that at $1,500. That is almost always paid by the buyer, so we put that as a $1,500 debit to the buyer. Again, this is going into an escrow account, it's not going to the seller, so no entry on the seller side of the equation. Then finally, in our example here, we have a recording fee, and typically the buyer pays for the recording of the deed, and we're going to put a $50 debit to him. That $50 goes to the courthouse for the recording fee, not to the seller, so there's no entry on the seller. So now we'll add up each of these columns. And we see here that the buyer has total credits of $371,000 and total debits of $513,100. So we're going to take the total debits minus the credits, and that gives us the cash that the buyer has to bring to the table for closing. In this case, $142,100. On the seller side, seller's getting $500,100 in credits. He's got $334,400 in debits. So in this case, we'll take the credits minus the debits, and the seller's going to walk home with $165,700. So let me leave that up there for you guys to look at. And let me flip over to the Facebook page and see. Oh, I got some questions or comments at least. Don't see any particular questions, but if anybody does have a question, please pop it in there, and I'll see if I can help you out. While we're waiting for those questions to come up, I just want to say I hope that all of you are staying safe and healthy, and that we all get out of this here in a short period of time. It's been frustrating, I know, for a lot of you folks that are trying to get your tests taken and get on the road. I can say you haven't missed a whole lot because things have pretty slowed down. It's been difficult to show properties, and people don't want strangers going through their homes, and people don't want to go through strange homes. But hopefully in the next few weeks we'll get that straightened out. So there's a question about broker commission on both buyer and seller. Typically what you'll have is the seller will be paying the commission. In some cases, the seller doesn't pay a commission. For example, you may have a for sale by owner who insists that he's not going to pay a commission, or you have somebody that is going to pay, a below market rate commission, and we can't say what the market rate is. You can't really discuss commissions in a public forum because it is a negotiated item. But to protect yourself on the buyer side, you often will execute what's called a buyer agency agreement. So the buyer will sign an agreement with his with his agent, that the agent is guaranteed to get X% commission on the transaction. Now, most typically, that X% will be covered by what the listing broker is paying to cooperating brokers. For just example's sake, let's say it was an agreement for 10%, and the listing broker was only paying 5% as a co-op fee, then the buyer would be responsible for the other 5%. Those are very much exaggerated numbers, but it gives you an idea of the concept, and it's not something that happens very often. Let's see. Which ones are negotiable? Virtually anything in a real estate contract is negotiable. Many of the contracts will have default language going one way or another. If go back and look at some of these items, the earnest money always comes from the buyer. The loan origination fee, you could have seller concessions at the closing that would cover that loan origination fee. So you'd have one line item for loan origination fee, which would be a debit to the buyer, and then you'd have a seller concession of the same amount that would be a credit to the buyer. So a net would be nothing to the buyer, and the seller would be the one ultimately paying that amount. The tax allocations, those are almost always allocated between the two parties. Survey, that's a negotiable item for sure. Some people think that it's the duty of the seller to provide a clean survey with the property. Others, think, well, the buyer, he's the one that's being protected by the survey, so he ought to be going to the survey company he wants and getting a survey. Similar things with the title insurance areas. Almost always the lender's policy will be paid by the buyer, but the owner's policy can be negotiated. It can be split in half, and a lot of times these fees are split in half. I'd say unpaid taxes that were due from a prior year would almost always go to the seller. Brokerage commissions are negotiated between the broker and his client when they do the listing. Appraisal fee, again, you could have seller concessions that would cover that. The taxes and insurance reserves are almost always the buyer responsible for that. Recording fee, I didn't have in here the closing fee. Often there's $150 fee for each, the buyer and seller, for paying somebody to handle the actual closing itself. Sometimes that'll be on one side or the other. A lot of it is kind of a wash, because if you're not paying it in these fee allocations, and it gets reflected in the purchase price. I tend to like to haggle more on the price and not worry about who's exactly paying what in each of these individual fees. So really looking at it on a net basis, what's this number that the buyer's getting? What's the net number that the seller's having to pay, or the seller's getting, I should say, but what the buyer has to bring is probably more important. Let me run back to the questions. That's all I see so far. So I hope that has been helpful, and I will end it here. And I'll leave this up, and if anybody has any questions going forward, just pop them in there, and I'll try to respond on the Facebook page. Again, hope everybody stays safe and healthy, and have a great weekend.